so sorry for falling off the face of the earth for almost a month, if not a month. A lot has happened. I started a new job. I really like working at this new spot. The money is really good. I like the clientele for the most part. I like my coworkers. I can honest to God say I like my coworkers, and that's a good feeling. I'll spare y'all. So today was gonna be a little bit of just a ramble video. But who wants to just listen to me talk forever? No one. So, I mean, well, maybe some of you. But, I actually got reminded, because, I read the comments. I check every day. And I wanted to make something, but I just have not had the energy to, record anything. Like I said, I've been working, about 6 days a week. Just getting this new place set up. Anyways, I was at work, and one of my coworkers was like, I was reading out loud just for funsies this book I checked out called Tiny Traumas. It says, when you don't know what's wrong, but nothing feels quite right. When I go to the library, I am super duper lazy. I am not trying to, pilfer and, scan through all the books, and I like display books because they are right in my face. I actually cracked this open today at 20 minutes before work, so I stopped and read a little bit in my car. Read a little bit during my shift, and my coworker was like, Les, you have a perfect voice. I feel like I would listen to you on an audiobook on the couch and fall asleep. And I was telling Mark earlier, I literally told her, well, I've got fantastic news for you. That's literally, I have a channel dedicated to that. But most people in my personal life actually aren't into ASMR, which is kind of weird. Well, not weird, but just unexpected, I guess. And I cut my finger today at work, cleaning. So I got this little big Baby Yoda band-aid. You can't really see, but yeah, it's Baby Yoda in the Mandalorian. Anyways, so, I can't sleep right now. So I figured why not upload something for you guys, read something for you guys. So without further ado, Tiny Traumas, when you don't know what's wrong, but nothing feels quite right. And this is by Dr. Meg Errol. We are going to skip the intro because I already read it and I don't feel like reading it. Chapter 1. Tiny T Trauma and Why It Matters. In this chapter, we will explore how trauma affects physical and mental health, the difference between big T and tiny t trauma, the many and varied sources of tiny t, the psychological immune system, how we can use tiny t as psychological antibodies. In this first chapter, we'll look at the differences between big T and tiny t trauma, as every experience we have shapes us. There's no denying this. It's useful to define these as it starts to explain why so many of us feel a bit crappy so much of the time. We will also look at a number of sources of tiny t trauma, with real-world examples to give context to this type of emotional assault, which typically hides in plain sight. Indeed, this is one of the very reasons why it can be so damaging. Also, I think I've mentioned on here before, but if you're new here, I applied to start grad school in the fall for clinical mental health counseling to become a therapist. So that is why I have an interest in this book. And also, honestly, like I said, I've been going through it. So, psychology is a relatively new discipline that's only been studied with robust methods for the last century. So please forgive the field for taking a bit of time to get to grips with low-level trauma. The first step is to observe what's happening on the ground floor, as it were, and ensure that what professionals like psychologists study and research is a clear reflection of people's lives. You can share your examples also with the hashtag TinyT. Nobody's gonna do that, but whatever. To help others feel less isolated in their experiences and add to the evidence base. But for now, let's get started. When was this published? Like nobody uses hashtags. 2023. Big T trauma and health. Until relatively recently, researchers and psychologists have tended to focus on significant negative events that occur in people's lives. It makes sense, as these are the ones that cause acute psychological illness and for which people seek professional help. These include life-limiting and at times heartbreakingly life-threatening mental health conditions such as major depression, generalized anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and a whole host of others documented in the Mental Health Bible called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM. In this and other earlier versions, Big T trauma was a feature in many of the listed conditions. These are the obvious and horrendous situations that we often... Oh my gosh. Sorry, I can't read. These are the obvious, horrendous situations that we know often lead to mental and physical health problems. Experiencing a war zone, childhood sexual, physical, or emotional abuse, rape or molestation, being caught up in natural disasters such as fires, earthquakes, tornadoes, and hurricanes, or being on the receiving end of acts of violence such as armed robbery or terrorism, all constitute Big T trauma. In the most up-to-date 5th version of the DSM, so known as the DSM-5, there are 157 separate diagnosable disorders, over 50% more than when that tome. I'll have to look that up. Was first published in 1952. Does this mean that as humans we have developed this many more mental health conditions? I'd say perhaps some, but mainly we're just getting much better at recognizing and defining human experience and suffering, and now we're aware that other events, many of which are more common, can lead to emotional and functional problems. Major life events that most of us will experience at some point. Fortunately, most of us won't experience the severe events within Big T trauma, but at some point we will all lose loved ones. Many of us will get divorced, and even joyous occasions can feel awfully stressful. Childbirth, weddings, Christmases even. These are instead what psychiatrists Thomas Holmes and Richard Ray, we'll say Ray for now, it's R-A-H-E, coined as major life events. The two doctors pored over 5,000 sets of medical notes to see if patients' stressful life experiences were related to later health issues, and compiled a list of events from the most traumatic, death of a spouse, to something less significant but still stressful, such as a minor violation of the law, who hasn't had a traffic fine, with points or life change units attached to each incident. Along with the severity of these events, how many happened together in the space of a year appear to be an important indicator of health problems. By adding together patients' life change units, the psychiatrists were able to see that a total score of 300 or more put people's health at risk. Between 150 and 299, there was a moderate risk of developing an illness, and below 150 yearly total units gave individuals an only slight risk of poor health. So, we can get the sense that some of the things we experience through life may make us vulnerable to both physical and mental health issues, particularly if they hit in a short space of time. But this isn't the whole picture. Even though there are many studies that support this theory,
Some also find that people who haven't reached the magical cutoff threshold in the life event scale develop problems. Why would these things make one person very ill, but not another? This, I propose, is where Tiny T comes into its own. Tiny T trauma, the missing link. As an academic in my early career, I was part of a research group called the Chronic Illness Research Team, and we carried out studies on all sorts of illnesses and how these conditions affected patients. This is actually why I started writing books in the first place, as students associated with our module, The Psychology of Physical Illnesses, tended to have some history of long-term health problems or were at the time feeling pretty down and wired with anxiety, although that was not surprising for third-year psych undergrads. In response, my colleagues and I started writing books for the mainstream, rather than just dusty scientific journal articles. And here it really started to dawn on me that the significant big T traumas and life events that researchers talked about couldn't account for many of the conditions we studied and worked with. I'd heard about a small t trauma from the work of psychologist Dr. Francine Shapiro, now best known for the creation of eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR. Wow. Side note, I've actually done a little bit of EMDR. I would say that the sessions I did have, I think I did three. I did 3 sessions of EMDR. They were pretty effective. Karuna Satori has some videos kind of like simulating it. I did it virtually. I would like to do it again in person, but like my therapist had me follow like a little like ball to both sides of the screen, and I literally had like flashes of like images, memories, and like visions, kind of. I don't know how else to explain it. There's something on the lid, sorry. And like you would have like she would say don't call them negative or positive thoughts, but I forgot the terms, but so say your thought is I don't know, I'm scared of dogs, or dogs are bad, a dog is gonna bite me, whatever. So you would come in with that thought, and then on a scale of 1 to 10, how much distress that thought causes you. So like say it, it gives me a 10, like I'm so uncomfortable, I'm very scared, right? So you do like the back and forth session with your eyes, and as you're doing the back and forth with your eyes, you'll get like images. Some people don't, but just my experience, you would get like images of maybe you being bit by a dog, or maybe you were actually bit by a dog as a child, or just like a vision of like a very aggressive dog, a dog in a cage baring its teeth, just random things, right? And so then you have a thought that would challenge that thought, something like dogs will not hurt me, or something to like reframe that thought. And then you would do it again, right? You would do the back and forth again, and then say you start to have an image of like petting a dog, or like cuddling with a dog, or a dog wagging its tail, or something like that. And so you're literally retraining your brain using rapid eye movement like we do in our sleep. Some people say it's hokey. I think it might have merit to it. I had my own personal beliefs and behaviors and thoughts I was trying to change, and it was effective for me, I would say. So if it works, who cares? Dr. Shapiro expanded the concept of trauma to experiences that happen frequently and to most people, such as emotional neglect or indifference, social humiliation, and family issues. But that did not meet the severity bar for either big T trauma or major life events. However, in her research and practice, Dr. Shapiro saw that these smaller assaults could also result in long-term emotional and or physical difficulties. Sometimes this type of trauma is described as little t also, but I prefer to call it tiny t, and we'll use this term throughout our journey together. But no matter what label I searched for in academic databases, I struggled to find small, little, or tiny trauma in scientific papers, clinical reports, or even more mainstream publications. Like so many important topics, it was somewhat ignored, passed off, and brushed under the carpet. Until now. One scientific paper I did locate on the topic looked at both big T and tiny T's in people with irritable bowel syndrome, IBS. Yeah, I've learned that gut health and gut issues and IBS and stuff like that are typically tied to stress and trauma. Isn't that crazy? I expected to see the same old results. The bigger traumas caused more symptoms and had a much more significant impact on the patient's lives, etc., etc. But, contrary to this, it was minor traumas that seemed to predict IBS symptoms rather than the big T, or life events that psychologists are taught led to ill health. People whose parents have been cold or aloof were more likely to have this tummy condition than those who had experienced full-on abuse or neglect. I found this fascinating. You know those moments when fireworks ignite in your mind? Not only were tiny T's important, they were more important in these patients than big T trauma. And she literally has, I believe this is a woman. Yeah, Meg. She literally has this. Sorry. In all caps. It's in all caps, y'all. I love this. This writer, the way she writes is perfect for me. It's very down to earth. I love it. It was with this eureka flash that I began to become somewhat obsessed with tiny T and how it could explain so many issues I saw in my then students and later therapeutic clients. Because even with the 157 diagnosable conditions in the DSM-5, you couldn't say that we've got it all covered. The majority of people who I see in my clinic would not tick all the boxes for a particular diagnosis. But does that mean that they're not in need or indeed worthy of help? My view is a very loud top of my voice. No. Literally in all caps. We all need a bit of help sometimes, but we're only now scratching the surface with conversations about mental health. And of course, like any discipline, this always begins with the most obvious and severe examples. Yeah. Then, in scientific study, we tend to trickle down to less striking, but just as deserving, presentations of whatever the topic of interest is. In this case, emotional pain and disequilibrium. Sweet. Rock the boat. Don't rock the boat, baby. To explain why less significant occurrences in someone's life would have such a big impact, I like to use the following analogy. Imagine your life is a boat, and you're sailing along year after year. Over time, your boat knocks against some rocks. There's a heavy storm, and fish nibble at the bottom of the hole. Each of these small bits of wear and tear on their own aren't a problem, especially if you are aware of the damage and have the tools to repair it. However, sailing is busy work, and sometimes you don't notice a leak, particularly if you're bobbing around in the wind and the rain. Usually, it is only when you start to have problems. For instance, you start losing momentum without knowing why, that you begin to realize you might be in trouble. This, in a nutshell, is tiny T trauma. A journey toward understanding tiny T trauma. With this analogy in mind, I started to collate some of the experiences that appear to be particularly troublesome for people. Maybe not on their own, but when combined with other tiny T's and even societal pressures. The examples in the rest of this chapter are not exhaustive, as this would make for a very long book indeed, but rather some of the most frequent tiny T's I see. Just like major life events, tiny T's happen at some stage, and when they make that first psychological dent, the low-grade trauma is often reinforced over the years. It's this reinforcement that starts to create a pattern. It could be a mental health pattern or a pattern of behavior as a result. These are the tiny T themes mentioned in the introduction, which we will explore in the rest of the book. But for now, let's take a quick trip through some widespread tiny T's that might just be familiar to you. Are y'all ready? I'm scared. I feel like she's about to read me for help. Tiny T's from childhood. Much of the research on trauma focuses on early life experience, which makes sense as this is the time when neural networks are forming, and so what happens to us can have the biggest impact. No one really gets through childhood unscathed, and nor should we, as these experiences go a long way in making us who we are. For many people, events that happened many years ago leave an indelible mark. Here are a few examples of childhood tiny T's that might seem familiar to you or loved ones. 1. The parent trap. The bonds we form with our primary caregiver, often our mom and dad, but it could be foster parents, aunts, uncles, whoever looks after us when we're young, leads to what we call an attachment style. In the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s and 70s, famous psychologists such as John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth observed that children seem to develop one of 4 distinct patterns of behavior and temperament in response to their environment. We'll look at this more closely in Chapter 8 on love, but these attachment styles have been studied in countless experiments, which show that the way a caregiver reacts to a baby or infant determines how secure they feel in the world. A secure attachment is found in families where consistency and sensitive reactions are given to children, whereas an avoidant attachment is formed if parents are somewhat distant or distracted. This matters as we carry these templates into our grown-up adult relationships. Sometimes it is good and sometimes not so good. As anything other than a secure attachment, the other 2 types are ambivalent and disorganized attachment. They didn't talk about avoidant. They didn't do anxious. Can lead us to the suboptimal situations that leave us feeling a bit rubbish a lot of the time. Oh, so this author is British. That changes everything. This is also how tiny T can trickle down through generations. All caregivers may themselves have numerous tiny T's that they've never had the chance to explore. Or there may be practical issues that mean children feel somewhat lonely at times. Many of us, for instance, were latchkey kids, coming home from school to an empty house, sorting ourselves out until working parents come home after a full-on day at work. I was a latchkey kid. There's no big T. Many parents and caregivers just need to work unsociable hours to pay the bills and keep a roof over their families' heads because the cost of living is now so high in many countries. Indeed, this is how society itself creates tiny T's for many people. Very true, very true. But before the snowflake accusers start, I'm not saying this alone leaves people with profound psychological distress. However, it is relevant, as some of these patterns show up in adult relationships, not just romantic ties, but friendships and interactions with others. By understanding this programming, we can start to change the script if it's causing us problems in life. Okay, that's actually really hard. I'm gonna stop. Or it may be that you and your caregivers have quite different personalities. Some people have parents who seem like aliens and are not like their kids at all. The extroverted dad taking his son to every football game and scout group when all the boy wants to do is write his stories underneath his duvet with a flashlight. It's a very long sentence. No one would call this poor parenting, and indeed many would say that pushing children outside their comfort zone is beneficial. But research tells us that this mismatch can cause a few tiny scrapes in our sense of attachment. It's really about feeling loved and accepted for who we are, unconditionally. Hence, there are countless subtle ways our early years can shape us. And remember, it's not that the caregiving was in any way neglectful, abusive, or bad. It just may not have suited our unique personalities and temperaments. But this is why Tiny T is imperative to understand. Even without any overt wrongdoing, we can still be affected by our experiences, contexts, and relationships. Without this awareness, remembering that this is the first step of the AAA approach, we're left in a perpetual state of not quite okayness that feels neither good nor bad, just some meandering, time-wasting place. Okay, I skipped the introduction, but the AAA approach is going to be awareness, acceptance, and action. Okay. We don't need no education. Tiny T's from school. Love it or hate it, school is a pivotal time in our development. You might have been Ferris Bueller at school, as Grace, the school secretary, says to Ed Rooney, the school principal and Ferris's nemesis. Oh, he's very popular, Ed. The sportos, the motorheads, geeks, sluts, bloods, wastoids, dweebies, dickheads, they all adore him. They think he's a righteous dude. Or, you may have been that sporto, a motorhead or geek. This lady is showing her age. School is a microcosm of the world. where we're often categorized and pigeonholed, not just by our peers, but often by our emerging sense of personal identity. Very true. The tiny T's come from the more subtle interactions rather than more serious abuses from, say, bullying. Overt bullying is a major childhood trauma, and many children do sadly endure this. But for many others, the less obvious bitchiness, feeling like a round peg in a square hole, the humiliation on the playing field, the stress of exams and pressure to succeed in an environment focused on test scores rather than meaningful learning, can all result in tiny T. A few years ago, I was working with someone who would be classified as extremely successful. He was a top executive with a sizable paycheck, a long marriage, and 2 bright children. Mo was the absolute life of the party, had loads of good friends, an amazing home, fast car, etc., etc., and seemed completely content. Yet he was steadily and increasingly piling on pound after pound with no end in sight. On the face of it, Mo explained away the weight gain as client lunches and his ability to now buy the best food and wine, which he also lavished on his loved ones. But this explanation wasn't getting him, or us, very far, so I asked Mo to do the following. Think of an event or experience which impacted or changed you in an important way, but you thought it wasn't serious enough to mention. I use this exercise with almost everyone in initial sessions, and almost universally, what emerges is a form of trauma. For some people, this question triggers a positive memory, but negative events tend to stick in the depths of our minds more stubbornly than positive ones, so usually, the story here is about tiny T in some form. Here's what came up for Mo. When I was 9 years old, my brother was diagnosed with ADHD. It's not like now. Back then, ADHD wasn't talked about and accepted by the school. Other parents in the community, with everyone understanding like it is now. Sorry, I can't read. Back then, it felt like people just thought Van, my brother, was a naughty child, always trying to get attention. I spent most of my school days with one eye on Van, making sure no one was bullying him, including teachers. I'm not talking about fistfights here. I joked them into leaving him alone. I was without doubt the class clown. The more I made the other kids and teachers laugh, the less they focused on Van. Maybe that's why I always laugh things off, laughing. But I feel it's not right even saying this, as it's not Van's fault I'm this weight. Van's not to blame for anything, and I mean anything. We clearly hit on something incredibly important here and touched a tender nerve. But it was the start of learning how our experiences can collate and lead to feelings and behaviors, in Mo's case, overeating, that are unhelpful, and at times downright damaging, as by this point Mo had high blood pressure and was warned by his doctor that he was pre-diabetic. He knew he had to do something to stop the mindless consumption of rich food and drink. The only thing about this that is so hard for me, especially as someone who's been in therapy for about 9 years, is, like, please don't perceive me. Like, you can see these connections that I can't necessarily see, and like these problems and these issues that I'm trying to heal and like fix, and it's like you're really trusting someone, like a therapist, to not judge you. But at the same time, like with me wanting to be a therapist, like I can see that it's truly just wanting to help people, and they're really just, there's no judgment, they're more so just trying to help you like point out negative habits and like cycles and patterns. I mean, it's very vulnerable thing to do, you know. Just a little bit more. We're not going to read too much more because I've been going for a little while. Tiny T is cumulative and context driven. When Mo next came to my office, he wasn't in his usual jovial mood. He sat down, shoulders somewhat hunched, and looked directly at the floor. He told me he couldn't believe how that single question could start to trigger so many light bulb moments in his mind, and he was feeling rather overwhelmed. Mo said he was finding it incredibly hard to accept that something to do with his brother's condition was impacting on him now, so we took some time to work through Mo's tiny T maze and see how we could connect the dots. In the introduction, I mentioned the AAA approach of awareness, acceptance, and action. Mo was trying to move straight past awareness into acceptance, and this was causing some real emotional distress. We needed to do some more work on the first A of awareness to lay the foundation for acceptance, because it didn't make sense to Mo that there was a direct correlation between Van's ADHD and his ever-expanding waistline. Well, not quite. I agreed this was far, far too reductionist, and so we needed to explore one of the fundamental tenets of Tiny T, that this type of trauma is cumulative. This is a huge difference between Tiny T and Big T. Big T is usually a distinct and easily identifiable event, or series of events such as abuse, that we can all immediately agree is highly detrimental to the mind and body. However, Tiny T's are a combination of smaller occurrences, peppered in particular contexts that build up over time. She's literally just explaining complex PTSD. This is literally just complex PTSD. As Mo mentioned, if he and Van were growing up now and in present-day schools, they both would have had very different experiences. Our knowledge of disorders like ADHD changes all the time, and we are much better at supporting individuals and their families these days. The situation was different 40 plus years ago, so it was vital that we place the Tiny T within its historical and chronological context. This enabled Mo to shift his mindset from thinking that the Tiny T implied that his dearly loved brother was somehow to blame. This awareness of the context of Tiny T can be transformative in allowing space for the second A in our approach, that of acceptance. Connecting the dots. Often, when we start our detective work around Tiny T, the connections appear in a rush, a bit like the floodgates opening for the first time. Mo began to link Tiny T's together in that he would binge eat during recess, lunchtime, and after school as a way of burying his feelings and fears. Food was a big deal in his family and associated with love and comfort, but it wasn't just this association that drove his overeating behavior. As Mo piled on the pounds, he developed a persona of the funny kid, and this was like his superpower. It protected not just Mo, but his entire family from the hurtful things people would say and do. Everyone seemed to love Mo, and when he left school and secured his first sales position, taking potential clients on expensive meals seemed to always win him the contract. This was a win-win situation, wasn't it? Humor and food now led to success and financial security, not just a buffer from bullying. What started off as a Tiny T now became a pattern so extraordinarily ingrained that even when Mo's doctor told him time and time again that he needed to make some dietary and lifestyle changes, it felt impossible. I hope it's becoming clearer that this is why understanding Tiny T's is so important but often overlooked. First, the shame that Mo felt mentioning his brother and how Van's diagnosis might have impacted on him essentially prevented Mo from ever letting the awareness of these events come into his consciousness. But then, playing the classic game of reverse misery trumps, in which Mo discounted his own feelings because what he experienced wasn't as bad as what his brother must have felt, is again a stark characteristic of Tiny T. It makes us feel unworthy of care and compassion. This mind game also stops people from moving from awareness to acceptance in the AAA approach, as, by its very nature, Tiny T doesn't seem as bad as Big T. It's so much easier to put your finger on one Big T event and believe that only such significant traumas or major life events are worthy of our attention. But that simply isn't the case. For Mo, it wasn't just a situation at school that led him to my office. He is a complex being like the rest of us. Yet, it was notable, telling, and had an impact on the intervening years. The love for his brother and instinct to protect Van led Mo to become hypervigilant of teasing or bullying, so much that it was just easier to always play the role of the class clown. This illustrates why it's so useful to start with one particular episode and work way back from there, but it can be useful to find more Tiny T's too. The next section is Tiny T's from relationships. I am definitely going to keep reading. I love this book so far. 21 pages in, and I've already been trying to think and read and be present on camera at the same time, but no, she definitely popped off with this book, and I just realized there's one little So,
I like this book so far. Definitely excited to see what's next. I love you guys. So glad to get some content up. Honestly, I'll probably edit this and upload it tonight. It shouldn't take too long. Just want to get something out there for y'all. Anyways, I hope you are asleep.